Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and today I wanted to show you the advantages of using freezer paper to foundation paper piece your quilt blocks and how to do it. I love paper piecing because it allows you to create intricate and precise quilt top designs that would otherwise be challenging or impossible to achieve. By sewing the fabric onto a paper foundation and using the lines as a guide, you can achieve really accurate shapes and sharp points, making it one of my most favorite quilt piecing techniques. The one downside of paper piecing is taking out the paper at the end. I know this is one of the major reasons why a lot of quilters don't paper piece. I usually don't mind this part as long as I use a nice lightweight paper and have something good to watch while I'm ripping out the paper. Today, I'm going to show you an alternative to using paper while paper piecing. But if you're interested in the more traditional technique, be sure to check out the link below. I have a tutorial for that. So let's talk about an alternative for paper piecing while foundation paper piecing. Today, I'm going to show you how I do it with freezer paper. And the best part about it is I do not have to rip my paper out at the end. I just remove the freezer paper and it comes off all in one piece. And then I can use this template over and over again. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate this, but first let's gather up our supplies. First, you'll need your template. So this could be just a foundation paper piecing pattern. I'm going to use this one. Instead of photocopying it multiple times like what you would if you used regular paper, you only need one copy. We're going to be transferring it on to freezer paper, and this I just get in my grocery store by the roll. It's also helpful, but you don't need it, to have a light box. You can always use your window. I'm going to be demonstrating on a light box. You'll need a pencil and a ruler. I have mine here. And then when we get to sewing, also one other thing, it's also helpful to have some tape. I'll be demonstrating when we're tracing the pattern. When we're sewing, we'll need our sewing machine, some thread. You'll also need your rotary cutter. I like to use my add a quarter ruler. But if you don't have one of these, you can use a regular acrylic ruler. I'm going to demonstrate all of this. We'll need a cutting mat. And then we'll need an iron and a pressing surface. I really love this little mini Aliso iron. Again, I'll demonstrate it, and a wool cutting mat. I'm going to link to all these products that I use below. So let's get on to demonstrating this. Before we get started, let's talk about what foundation paper piecing patterns might work best with the freezer paper method that I'm going to demonstrate. When I'm deciding if I want to use regular paper or freezer paper to piece an FPP block, there's two factors I consider. First, am I going to make the block multiple times? And two, how detailed is the block? Because I use household freezer paper that I do not run through my printer, I'm going to take the time to manually trace the pattern, and I'll show you this in a minute. I typically use freezer paper if it's going to be worth my time in the end, sort of balancing how much time I'll save ripping paper out if I use traditional paper versus how long it's going to take me to trace the pattern if I'm using freezer paper. If I'm going to make the same block multiple times, then I'll use the freezer paper. If the pattern is pretty detailed, then I'll probably use regular paper and foundation paper piece traditionally. To me, it's not always worth it to spend lots of time tracing lots of lines, especially if I'm only going to make a block once for a quilt. It also may just be me, but I find that my piecing is a bit more accurate and more pleasurable to use regular paper that I have to rip out later if I have a pattern that has lots of detail or small sections. I have my new dual directions quilt pattern here, and for me, it's a great candidate for using the freezer paper. I'm going to make this block multiple times to make my quilt top, and the block also has very few sections, and all of them are a really decent size, so there's going to be no tiny paper piecing here. Let's get our freezer paper prepared so we can make this block over and over. As I mentioned earlier, I like to use just inexpensive freezer paper that I could find at the grocery store. The one downside of this is that you should not run this through your printer, especially a laser printer, or the wax coating will melt. So we're going to be doing a little bit of manually tracing. If you find that you like this freezer paper method but don't want to trace, there is pricier specialty freezer paper out there that you can run through your printer. You'll want to just triple check that you have the printer that is compatible. I'll link to those products below. So I went ahead and I grabbed off the roll of the freezer paper piece and I trimmed it down to be a little bit larger than the pattern. This is my paper piecing pattern or template that you would get with any FPP pattern. This is out of my dual directions pattern. I went and taped it down, and I'm going to be tracing on a light box, but you can always do this against a window as well. I first like to tape down my pattern just so it's one less thing that moves around. And then I'm going to take my freezer paper, and really important, I want to make sure that the waxy side is down and what is facing me, what I'm going to be tracing on, is the more paper side. It doesn't have a waxy feeling to it. I like to go ahead and tape this down as well. It's just one less thing moving that I have to make sure doesn't move around. Of course, before I do this, I'm going to want to make sure that that 1-inch test is measures exactly 1 inch so that I know my pattern is to scale. And then I need a pencil and a ruler. And I'm going to go ahead and just trace around every single line on this pattern. And again, I'm just transferring it to the paper side of the freezer paper, not the waxy side. Just using a regular old pencil. And I'm going to go all the way around. When I'm doing this also, I'm going to want to mark all of the numbers. We'll go ahead and speed up this. I just want to make sure that I get every single line, and we'll speed up the video. Once you have all of the lines traced, make sure you also have all of those numbers. You'll need them. And then what I do is I just kind of, before I commit to taking the whole piece of freezer paper off, I just lift it a little bit and make sure I traced all the lines, and I just realized I missed one line. So I'm going to put it down right where it was and trace that one line that I missed. We'll double check it before I pick it up. And yep, I got every single line. So what I'll do now is take up that freezer paper, and I want to then cut out on the outer line. So this is what it'll look like. I'll just trim that up. You can see I just cut along that outer line, just like you would with a regular foundation paper piecing pattern. I like to use a rotary cutter that I've dedicated for paper to do that. So now that we have this, we're ready to start sewing. Before you move on to the next step, make sure you took your time tracing. The more accurate your template is, the more accurate your piecing will be. Before we start sewing, there's one other thing I like to do that I find makes life a little bit easier later. And that is all of the lines that we're going to be sewing usually on, but in this case next to, I'm going to take an old room key, gift card, or credit card, and just use that, place it right on the line, and I'm going to fold back the template. By doing this now, I find it just is a little bit easier later. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll speed up this process. Okay, it's all pre-creased. And one other thing, the reason why I like to use a thin, like I said, gift card or room key or credit card is that because this is thinner, I find that I'm a little bit more accurate with where my lines are creased. If I was to use a thicker ruler, it would be a little bit more challenging to get the lines creased accurately. Now that I have my template prepared, we're ready to start applying fabric. I'm going to move my cutting out of the way and bring over my wool pressing mat, and I have my mini iron. I really love the mini irons for this because I can be much more accurate where I put my iron. I also will avoid areas I don't want to press. So first things first, we want to cover, just like we would with regular paper piecing, section 1. And I have my fabric here. So this is going to be what we're going to use for a guide. I want to turn it over. This is the waxy side. And I'm going to take my incorrect side of the fabric, wrong side of the fabric. That's the correct side. So I'm going to place the wrong side of the fabric against the waxy side. And then this, you may need to hold it up to a window or a light source. I want to make sure, just like we would with regular paper piecing, and if you're not familiar with this technique, I have a beginner video on paper piecing. Same idea. I want to have the fabric cover all of section 1, and I could see section 1 with the pencil lines and the creases, and then some, at least I'd say a quarter of an inch away. I like to go more for 3/8 or a half an inch if you're a beginner more. And I could see that that fabric will cover all of section 1. So I want to carefully flip it over, and I want to press on the fabric side. And again, this is where the mini comes into play. I can hit just wide enough to hit just the fabric. I want to avoid touching the template with my iron because it's a little bit waxy or sort of plastic, I should say. I don't want that getting on my iron. So I'm just going to press that, and I could see it is adhered. So again, this is going to be the front of the block, so my correct side of my fabric. This is the back of my block, and I'm going to use those guides. I'm going to move the pressing mat out of the way. And then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to now actually sew on section 2. And we're not going to sew through the paper, we're going to sew next to the paper, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I like to then, again, we're going to sew along that line, sewing section 1 to section 2. I'm going to fold this back, and then I'm going to put the correct sides of the fabric touching. So correct side of the fabric, correct side of the fabric. And then I want to align the fabric I'm joining, so this magenta fabric. I want to make sure that it is aligned so that when I do sew it, all of section 2 will be covered. If this is something new to you, again, please check out that mini workshop I have, mini online class for foundation paper piecing. I talk about how to position your fabric. But if you're used to paper piecing, you'll know how to do this. And now what I'm going to do is, this is a little bit different than regular paper piecing. Normally I would open up the paper and sew along that line. Instead, I'm going to keep the paper closed and sew right next to the line. I'm going to reposition my camera so you could see what that looks like on the machine. Okay, I'm now ready to sew. You could see I have my paper folded back. Again, a little bit different if you're used to doing traditional paper piecing. The other thing I did was I went ahead and usually with foundation paper piecing, you set your stitch length pretty tight to, like, I typically do like a 1.5. Because we're not sewing through the paper, we don't need to do that. We can keep it. I usually do it as like a 2.0 or a 2.2 stitch length. That way, if we do have to use our seam ripper, it's a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and sew. I'm going to put my needle down, and I want to make sure I'm sewing just to the side of the freezer paper, so to the right of the freezer paper. And I like to do a couple of back stitches or stitches in place. And I can go as slow as I need to. I'm stitching right next to that crease. So I want to make sure to avoid the paper, the freezer paper. If I do hit it, it's not the end of the world. It's going to make a little bit of a hole. One other thing, today my regular presser foot is working just fine, but sometimes I find that this wax paper is a little bit slippery and things don't, against my presser foot, and things don't quite feed through at the same rate, which can be a little bit frustrating. If I have that happen to me, what I'll do is I'll just put on my walking foot. That seems to fix things. It seems to be able to grip the freezer paper and bring everything through. I'm going to go ahead, and I know where to stop because I creased then for the next piece. So my line for my next section would be right here. I don't know if it's showing up on the camera, this crease, and I can always put a little pencil mark, and I could see that if I had opened it up and kind of looked through a window, but I also see that there's a crease there. So I know that that's almost like for paper piecing, the line that I'm going to stop at. And then I like to do a couple of back stitches or stitches in place. And then we could take it off the machine, and let me bring it over to my cutting mat. Before I trim my seam allowance and press it and show you how that works, I'll take a look. I'm going to zoom in so you could see my stitches. And you could see I used a neutral thread, so it's a little bit hard to see, but I stitched right next to the paper. So it's coming up a little bit, and you could see I did not go through the paper. If I did go through the edge of the paper, not a big deal, it's just a little bit messy. So now, before I open it up, I'm going to go ahead and trim my seam allowance to 1/4 inch. You can use, let me get this zoomed back in, a regular acrylic ruler. I like to use my Atta ruler. It kind of just nestles right against that paper, so I don't even have to visually look at it. And I have a 1/4 inch. Go ahead and I'll open up my magenta fabric, and I can tell that it totally covers section 2. So now what I'll want to do is press, and again I want to make sure that I press just on the fabric side, never on the paper side. And I also want to try to avoid having my iron touch this waxy plastic surface. The idea is that we're not sewing to the paper, we're sewing sort of along those edges, and then the hot iron is adhering the plastic wax to the fabric until we need to remove it. So I just want to make sure that's hot enough. It doesn't have to be every little edge, but enough of it. I could see, yeah, that's adhering. Again, the trick with this is making sure that your iron doesn't hit the exposed wax plastic. And then I'm just going to continue to repeat this. Same thing. I'm going to now want to sew on section 3. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of this and speed up the video until I have all of the sections on the block filled up. Now that I have all of the sections sewn together, I'll give it one good last press. I will say, while I was sewing with my regular presser foot, there were some times when it was getting a little bit caught up in my machine, getting a little bit slippery. The freezer paper and the fabric weren't going through at the same rates. It wasn't enough for me to be frustrated to get up and get my walking foot, but if that was happening and I was making this block a number of times, I probably would have changed out my presser foot to something else. Again, I find that my walking foot works really, really well, but you might have another foot that will also work well. So just something to be aware of. So all of my fabric is attached now. It's all sewn together. The only thing that's attaching it to this paper is the waxy plastic surface that I've been ironing it to. Before I do anything else, what I want to do is trim up the excess fabric, get that out of the way. So I'm going to take my regular acrylic ruler. I don't need the iron anymore, so let me get that out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and trim it up, and I want to make sure that the edge of the acrylic ruler is aligned with the edge of the paper, the freezer paper. And then I'm going to trim off this extra fabric. And my block is complete. And again, the real benefit to using the freezer paper is this. Instead of ripping out paper, because I sewed next to the paper and not through the paper, I simply just peel back the freezer paper. I have my finished quilt block. There's the back, the front, and I have my freezer paper, and I can use this over and over and over again. I have many pieces. Here I actually marked them because I was curious. This one I've used over and over again 5 times. This one is close to 17 times. After a while, the plastic and wax will wear down. It won't be as adhesive. So if you just find that the fabric isn't sticking as well to the freezer paper when you're ironing, pressing, then that probably means it's to make a new, it's probably time then to make a new template. I hope you're inspired to give freezer paper a try on your upcoming paper piecing project. I'm listing below some of my favorite patterns to piece using freezer paper, and I hope you'll give one a try. If you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe so that you get notified when new tutorials are available. You can also get access to my complete library of free tutorials and patterns. I'm going to put that link below. Be sure to check it out. And until next time, happy stitching and quilting.